Okay, so we are officially joined with Jessica Lyles. Hello, Jessica. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello.
So, I have already given the listeners everything they need to know about you, your accolades, the books you've written. Before we get into our conversation, what do you want the listeners to know about you beyond your bio?
Think beyond the bio, I would point out that I'm a mom myself of two toddler boys, two under four. So it's been quite interesting, but also a wife and of course a businesswoman. So I would definitely know where the listeners are coming from with just having to juggle a lot while also making sure that you still make time for yourself.
Yes. So today we are talking about motherhood and boundaries, how to reclaim your space without guilt. And so obviously you are a mom. I think about this topic in through the way of my mother. For I have watched her as I grew up, and I watch her now set her boundaries or struggle with boundaries at times too. And so
Yeah.
I think it would be kind of like a good idea for us to even consider how we saw the need for boundaries in our own lives, how we saw our caretakers exhibiting boundaries. Yeah. So do you want to go ahead and get started? What did you see of your mom as you were growing up?
Yeah, this is a good one. My mom had five girls and she was a single mom. So there was a lot on her shoulders to provide for us. But with that, she wasn't able to make a lot of time for herself in regards to like her self-care, her needs and her emotional, excuse me, and mental needs. And so in regards to boundaries, I didn't really see many because there was just, I think that she didn't really know that she had the space or she could give herself permission to have those boundaries, not just with us as her kids, but also with work, because she was providing for us. I don't think she really put a lot of time boundaries in place to ensure that she even had the opportunity to spend a little time with herself or to spend more time at home. And I think too, as like, unfortunately, as a Black woman, even within our external families or outside of the household, the boundaries can be quite flexible, to say the least. And so she was thrown into a lot in our extended family as well. So I don't think I ever really saw my mom sit down unless she was laying down for the night.
Yeah. I love that you said that. Like when it comes to our families, and sometimes, there's some boundary crossing that might happen and we're required to be a bit more flexible than we want to be. I think with my
Hmm.
mom, I saw her working 9 to 5. She'd come home. She also was kind of like a homemaker in a way.
Hmm.
If she had anything broken in the house, she needed to redo her bathroom, she was doing that. She was going to Home Depot, getting
Oh,
all
wow.
the supplies. I saw my mom like really juggling a lot. And between her friends, like she still was a party. My mom was a party girl. I think as an adult, I had to like really learn about my mom in a different way than I
Yeah.
saw her as a kid. But I always saw her moving. And to the same point that you said, I don't really know if I saw her setting boundaries, but I would hope that her ability to still like go hang out with her friends was some of that boundary setting for herself. But other
Right.
than that, I just always saw her on the go. So I think that is a good point for us to kind of like talk about Black women and their boundaries in general. And you talked about the expectations that maybe our families have around them. How do
Mhm.
you think that the societal expectations on Black women interfere with their ability to set boundaries?
I think we have two layers to it. The first layer is that we're women in general. And so society sees us as, to steal your word, the homemaker, the nurturer, the provider in the emotional sense. And so we already have that piece that we kind of have to tackle. But then to also be a Black woman on top of that, there are a lot of cultural things that come into play. I hate to be like this, but it's even in the scale of like, the way we treat our Black boys versus our Black girls, with how we raise them. We raise our Black girls to have this very, very high standard, whereas our Black boys, for the most part, they can stay home. They can do the things in regards to like sports and the fun things and stuff like that as long as they're providing. Whereas for women, we're supposed to check all the other boxes. Or at least, at least that's the stereotype. That's the cultural expectation. Not saying that's in everybody's household, but that is something that's instilled in us within a young age. And then for us, you and I, to see that our moms kind of fell right in tune with that. So it's not only what we were seeing, what we were hearing, but also what we were experiencing through our Black mothers, right? And so I think it's a great call out to make sure that we say it's not just that you're a woman, but you're a Black woman, because there's so much more that comes into play there. Even in regards to like, outside the society, going back to just the external family, there are expectations that, my grandmother or my great grandmothers have about me fixing my husband's plate, when we're
Hmm.
having dinner.
Hmm.
So some of it's really minuscule, but it does take a lot of time, energy, and effort away from us being able to put that within ourselves.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about, I don't know, you saw the controversy last year with Keke Palmer and she went to the Usher show, and then all of a sudden
Yeah.
everyone had something to say, but
Yeah.
specifically the father of her kid. And he said essentially, like, you're a mother, you're not supposed to wear that or be behaving like that. And so just even thinking about the expectations that even change now that you're a mom, you can't go out, you can't wear certain things. And I mentioned that my mom used to go out
Mhm.
when I was younger. But to know that those societal expectations still exist, even for younger mothers now,
Yeah.
it's like, when does it end? And how does a person set their own boundaries for themselves and become the type of mother that they want to, not just because it's the type of mother that their own mother or their grandmother or their partner said they should be, but the mother that they want to be for themselves. So we found around the word boundaries, and I feel like it is so important to define what we are talking about because a lot of people use the term boundaries, especially
Yeah.
online, but do we really know what it means? And so I want to read something from an article, and then I want us to talk a little bit more about it. But I think it's just really important to have an operational definition. And so I am reading this article from Tars Chernata 2024, and I will plug it in the show notes. But it says personal boundaries or limits refer to the internal boundaries that an individual establishes for themselves in their interactions with the surrounding world and other people. These boundaries determine what type of behavior, communication, or influence they accept from others, as well as what they are willing to give or receive in interaction with others. The concept of personal boundaries reflects the level of self-awareness, self-esteem, and interaction of the individual with the surrounding world. And then I just want to read one more part of this. One of the domestic researchers, Herb Eva, defines personal boundaries as a psychological formation that arises as a result of interaction or establishment of equal relations between the desire to preserve authenticity and the need for adaptation in society. The main tasks of personal boundaries are maintaining harmony and establishing context with the surrounding world. So I just gave a mouthful. But what are your thoughts on that definition?
I think the thing that stuck with me or hit me hard was when you used the word harmony, because, even with that, you really have to match energy, right? You have to match tone. And so someone is possibly given a little bit more, whereas someone may be given less, and it fluctuates. And I think that that's a great word to use in regards to boundaries, because the boundaries we have with work versus with our families versus with our spouse and ourselves are all going to be different. And they all require that level of flexibility depending on the situation that comes up. So that word is, I'm going to stick that in my back pocket. I like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I loved it too. And that's why I was like, I'm going to read just a little bit more because
Yeah.
I think that is such a great word to use when people get to the point of even trying to set their own boundaries. They're really trying to find
Hmm.
harmony in some type of way of how to exist within themselves and between other people. So I'm really curious with the work that you do, Jess. How do you help mothers untangle who they really are from what the world expects them to be?
Ooh, this is such a great question. And honestly, it's a struggle that many of us face, right? Myself included. But boundaries usually feel hard because we've been conditioned, right? Especially as Black women, to be everything for everybody. So from that young age, we're taught to be strong, to push through, and to take care of everybody else first. But what happens is we end up exhausted, overwhelmed, sometimes even resentful. And the truth is that setting boundaries is not supposed to be about shutting people out. And that's like the first thing that I teach everyone. It's not about just putting these walls in place and nobody can come in because everybody's been so rude or disrespectful. It's about protecting your energy so that you can show up fully and intentionally for the people that you love. And so, to use that same imagery, usually I tell people we're not setting up this brick wall, we're building a fence, right? We're going to open that up, we're going to close it as much or as often as we need to. And with most fences, we have that space, right, where we can allow energy to flow in and out. depending on what's going on. And so usually that's where I start. It's just reframing their mindset around setting boundaries in the first place, especially moms.
Yes, I love the analogy of the fence versus the wall, especially because it reminds you that one, you are the one in control of opening and closing that
Yes.
fence, right? Because when we
Yes.
start talking about how do you even set boundaries and enforce them, that's also an important part. Like you still have the ability to open it for yourself or close it.
Hmm.
So, one of the other things that I want to make sure that we talk about really quickly before we get into the deep dive of how to set boundaries is the different types of boundaries, because some people may not realize that you might have a boundary in one area and none in another.
Hmm.
So did you want to talk a little bit about the types of boundaries that people can set for themselves?
Yes, forgive me, but I'm going to speak in layman's terms because I feel like we all went to school, but I like to tell people that we have the textbook in our mind, but it's our job to decipher it for you, right? To really break it
Yes.
down. So many different types of boundaries. To your point, I usually call them strict or flexible. There should never be a situation where you have no boundaries at all. They should either be flexible or strict. And usually I tell people your strict boundaries are the things that you will completely cut a relationship off for. And for some people, that's lying or cheating or stealing, whatever the case may be, but it's dependent upon you. And it's a hard stop. Boundary really depends on the situation, right? And it may even depend on the person because it depends on the relationship. And I think that honestly, the flexible boundaries are the ones that's the most difficult for people to set because they feel like they have to kind of set a rule for themselves and that's it. There's no changing it. Instead of identifying it as a standard, right? I have this expectation on how this situation should go or this person should treat me. Now, there are also like subsets to all of that, right? We have our physical boundaries. I think a lot of us saw that during the pandemic where, 6 feet, and it's kind of been 6 feet ever since. But, I think about my kids, especially my son. He has a boundary with his hair. He doesn't like anybody but his barber to touch his hair, right? And he will let anybody know. Versus, there are also emotional and spiritual boundaries that, it becomes such a subset, and I really break all of them down to people to really remind them that yet again, you can be flexible and you can be strict in multiple different ways.
Yes. I love that. And I know that, when clients come in for me, and I'm sure with you because this is the work that you do specifically,
Mhm.
but some of them are not at the rigid part yet or the
Mm-mm.
flexible. Obviously, they're working to get there, but when they first come in, they're at soft boundaries. And some of them even have like spongy boundaries, right? So those are the ones that are
Yep.
inconsistent. Sometimes they, are open, sometimes it's rigid and it's a little like lopsided and all over the place. But then you have the
Right.
people that are exhibiting softer boundaries where they're easily influenced, and it's kind of like whatever you want goes instead of what I am also wanting for myself. And unfortunately, these people can be, sometimes prone to be manipulated by others who see people who have a lack of boundaries and then take advantage of those things.
Exactly.
Yeah. Another thing that I wanted to talk about too with boundaries, you mentioned like time boundaries earlier too.
Mhm.
Definitely an important boundary. Boundaries can show up with sexual boundaries, right? Physical
Mhm.
boundaries, emotional, mental, and spiritual boundaries too. And so, what are you going to accept or tolerate when it comes to personal space or your bodily autonomy? What do you expect or accept when it comes to emotional responses that you're receiving or giving to others, right? And so there's so many different ways that people can set boundaries in their lives that they may not even be aware of.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. So now let's really talk about boundaries in regard to motherhood. So I'm curious when it comes to the boundaries that mamas should be setting, Black mamas, what are they and do they extend to the kids?
Okay, so I'm going to tackle the hard question first. It's not hard for me, it's going to be hard for everyone to hear. Yes, you should have boundaries with your kids. And this is coming from not just a therapist, but I'm a mama who was pregnant with one and still breastfeeding the other. So the touched out was a understatement to say the least. But I think it's incredibly important that you have boundaries in place in every aspect of your life and with everyone. When we set boundaries with our kids, we're also teaching them how to set boundaries, how to fulfill or decide not to fulfill certain expectations, right, within relationships. If it helps you, for those of you who are listening, you're still teaching them, right? You're not just teaching them how to treat you, you're teaching them how to respect others' space. Okay, so I really, really, really wanted to call that out because I know it's really difficult. And a lot of moms think, I can't say no to my kids, or, I give my kids the world. And it's not that you're not giving them the world, but you should also be setting a realistic expectation for what they will experience as someone out in this world. Now I'll go back to the original question, because I think that one's just always the hardest.
No, and that's a whole word though that you just
Yes.
gave. So thank you.
And it was tough, because you have your societal expectations, but also we have expectations for ourselves, and we think that we're not being successful as moms, or we're not showing adequate love if we put certain boundaries in place, and that's not the case. And I'm sorry, I forgot the first part of your question.
Yeah, no, I would just wanted to know what types of boundaries do you think Black mamas need to be setting like in their day-to-day life?
Okay, I think there are three that you should set like initially, and it should be in each area. One with your family, and I mean like extended family, your mom, your grandma, your aunt, whomever. One with your spouse or whomever is living in the household with you, and then one with the kids. The one with the kids is easily placed, to be quite frank, because usually you just need to put a routine in play and they need to follow that standard. If they do, then usually that time boundary that we all usually want to set with our kids, it's pretty easy to follow for them. And so usually I recommend to moms that like nap time is sacred and bedtime is sacred. And so because those two are sacred, they need to wake up on time as well, right? But by putting those time boundaries in play, you are allowing more opportunity for you to do other things that may fuel you or that you need to take care of. Now, we also need to set the boundary with spouse or whomever is in the household, because they also need to have the expectation that you're going to take time for yourself, that you're not going to wear that mom title all day long, right? Or all week long, all month long, wherever the case may be. You gave that great example of Keke Palmer. And I think that was a perfect representation of this, that like as her person, he should have been the first one to say like, hey, she's Keke Palmer. One of those subsets, one of her titles is mom. Another title is actress. She's not acting all the time. Another title is singing. She does kind of sing quite often, but she has multiple titles that fall underneath who she is. And so you really want to make sure you have that expectation set with your partner, whomever's in the household. And last but certainly not least is with the extended family. Usually this is where those more rigid boundaries get set initially with most of the moms I work with, because most often the family is overly supportive, we'll say. And with that comes an abundance of opinions. And so, you're already trying to unlearn and relearn different ways to attach motherhood. And at the same time, you have people in your ear telling you the complete opposite, and really speaking to that inner child, right? Of all the ways you learned boundaries and time management and things like that when you were younger. And so you really have to do two things when it comes to setting that boundary. One, maybe just, speak your opinion or vent to other moms in your situation or someone that aligns with your values. So, because that could be your spouse. And then the second thing you're going to do is start to find comfort in telling them, yes, thank you. That's always my go-to, because you can pocket that opinion, that advice, that information, but you don't have to use it. But you can just let them give their 2 cents, and that's exactly what it is, 2 cents, and you put it in your back pocket. So that's a very long-winded answer, but I think when you set those three initially, you really set yourself up for success moving forward.
You know what came up for me as you were talking? First,
Hmm.
you started off by talking about setting boundaries with your kids,
Yeah.
because obviously, as the mother, you are teaching them in the process, right? And so they're
Hmm.
learning from you. And, as we get older, we actually realize a lot of the lessons that we learn from our parents, whether they
Exactly.
intended to teach it to us or not. And so, as a parent, when you are able to model healthy boundaries, then your kids are learning and picking that up. On the other hand, though, when you
Hmm.
have potentially watched your own parents not be able to model boundaries, and now they are expressing that they want you to go away from boundaries or do things in a certain way. I just wonder, and I can only imagine the disconnect and the difficulty
Yes.
of, maybe a parent who didn't have the ability to learn from their parents on how to set boundaries. Now they're expecting you to kind of do the same and be boundaryless. And that itself seems like it could be a struggle or a battle.
Oh, for sure. And I think that the first thing I usually tell people is extend grace. I'm a true Southerner, so I'm like, bless her heart, she doesn't know what you
Mhm.
know, or they don't know what you know, right? And you can't fault people for what they do or don't know. If they just do the best with the information that they were given. And so, to that same point, are you going to do the best with the information that you now have, right? I
Yes,
think most of our
yes.
parents, ourselves included, we like to say we want our kids to be better than us, right?
Hmm.
And so usually our supporters are giving us that information because they want to see us do good. They want to see us be the best mom or parent possible. And we just have to be the ones to filter through what we actually need to take in from that. Because again, they're just going based off their experiences and what they know, right? But you're going to know something completely different. And it's okay to take a little bit of theirs and a lot of yours and apply it.
I love that. A little bit of theirs and a lot of yours. And what are you going to do with what you know?
That's right.
Yes. Okay. So, one of the things, especially for the women listening, the mamas that are listening, I want to talk
Mhm.
about the cost of dishonoring your boundaries, the cost of working against your own self, right? What are some of the consequences to having poor boundaries? I talked earlier about people who may have softer, spongy boundaries. Like what's at stake for the mamas who are unable to actually implement their boundaries?
Yeah, I think initially we always notice the most common thing, right? We start to get overstimulated, overwhelmed, and burnt out. And we'll notice all three things in multiple ways. Usually we're snappy. And I say we because been there, done that as well, unfortunately.
Got
But
the
we're
t-shirt.
snappy, right? Things aren't getting done in the same ways that they were before, where you felt like you really were, doing a really good job about juggling it all. And now the balls are starting to fall, right? You're starting to notice that you're constantly tired. You're not sleeping well. You're not eating well. Like whether it's external, internal, you're going to notice those three things: overstimulation, overwhelm, and burnout. Because you're just drained. Your energy is constantly being drained. And then you start to get resentful. Why? Because everywhere you show up, everybody else has the energy you don't have. Everyone else has that freedom that you don't have, right? And it's not because they're doing something wrong, but it's because you either haven't taught them how to respect your space and your time and your energy, or you haven't been respecting your own, right? And I think the most important part, and I keep thinking about Kiki Palmer with this, you brought up such a good example, but it's like that losing sense of yourself. So a lot of moms wake up one day and realize that they don't know who they are anymore. They don't know what they like. They don't know if their career is still for them, if they even want to return to work. They don't know if their friends will still align with their goals and values and aspirations that they now have as a mom. They completely just had this shift in life. And it's almost like being in limbo. And so,
Yeah.
because you don't have that time to relearn this new you, it becomes even more frustrating when you finally do give yourself the time to relax or unwind or journal, whatever. You don't know what to do. You feel stuck. And so, you guess what? You might as well get back up and go back to being a mom, clock back into work, or do what you were doing before. And it's a cycle.
Yeah. So we were on each other's mind just a second ago because I was definitely thinking about Kiki Palmer too, again, because if I love Kiki Palmer. I've loved her since she was a little girl. It's very
Yeah.
talented. But her as an adult, like she's flourishing, right? We get to see her in her bag. And I just think what would have happened if she was not sure of herself, right? And
Mm.
this person's like, but you're a mother. Like, you can't dress like that. You can't go places like this. You can't do things like that, right? It would have been easy for her to just go inside of herself and say, you know what? I don't know who I am. I am going to make sure I put on the clothes that everyone else tells me I should have on. I'm going to make sure I don't go to these places. And then that sense of identity gets lost over time. And so
Yeah.
I think she is a good example of what it could look like to kind of hold your boundaries, even when the father of your children has come out against and said, no, not on my watch. And you're like, well, this is my watch and I am going to live life in the way that I want to and the way that I please. So, yeah. So I think the things that you've mentioned, especially in terms of like potentially losing yourself because you are pleasing what other people desire instead of pleasing yourself. Also wonder about the guilt for Black mamas who are like, well, I can't prioritize. I'm glad that Keke Palmer could go out and see Usher, but I couldn't do that if I wanted to, right?
Right.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about guilt when it comes to setting boundaries.
So it's funny. I feel like people try to find an escape with guilt in regards to like giving themselves an out. Like I should feel guilty because, and so to use the Kiki Palmer example, a lot of people I saw in the comments were like, well, of course she could do that. She probably has a nanny. She probably has a housekeeper. She probably has all these things, right? Because she has money. When really, to our point, it was what she worked on internally, and it was probably forcing herself to be uncomfortable and going out there knowing that regardless, someone was going to be unhappy, right? We've all had that experience, or, probably have seen where someone does become closed in, reserved, and we don't see them anymore after they have kids, right? We might see them in a bodily form, but you really don't see them anymore. And the first thing that most people think of is like, what happened? Where are you? Like, you should be taking care of yourself. You got to put yourself first, mama. Like, it's so easy to say. And on the back end, when we see her out doing her things and taking care of herself because she finally took that mom hat off, there's a whole different opinion. You shouldn't have dressed like that. You should have been back home at this time. Like, there are all these rules and standards that go with it that we don't necessarily have for ourselves. Letting go of the guilt, yes, it is hard, but it definitely starts with understanding what your expectations of yourself are as a mom. Because if you go by what anyone else says or what their expectations are, yes, you're always going to feel guilty. It is not going to align with what you're able to do consistently in motherhood or in parenthood, right? Because guilt is real and it creeps in. It starts to make you feel like you're neglecting your family, even though you're taking care of yourself, which we all know drains right over into them, right? But one call out I will say is that you can usually reframe guilt as opportunity for growth. So instead of thinking like I feel guilty for taking time for myself, I usually shift it to I'm learning how to take care of myself, and that's okay. I'm learning who the new Jessica is, and that's all right. I need time to learn who she is, to learn what she likes, right? And by knowing that, I'll become a better mom. Because when you do take that time to reset, you come back more patient. Or I don't know about you guys, but I'm a totally different person. I could deal with the yelling and screaming. I could deal with, some dust in the house and things like that. But I'm also more present. I actually will play with my kids a lot more. I'm more mindful of how I'm feeling, meaning I'm less irritated, I'm less snappy. That benefits everybody. And so I usually like to say, there's that like cliche saying of like, you can't pour from an empty cup. I don't usually use that one. I usually ask my mom, what are you pouring into your kids? Because if you think about all the gunk and mess that's in your cup, all your resentment, all your frustration and anger and burnout and overwhelm and just the whole spiel, you're pouring that into your kids. You're pouring that into your spouse, into your household. Because our cups are constantly full, right? It's constantly full of something, but it's about what you're putting in there.
Yeah, I love that. That is another expansion to that mantra that we know already, right? You can't pour from an empty cup, but you actually are pouring something. So what's feeding into their cups? You
Yes.
know,
I had
I
a
don't have.
client
Okay,
tell me, sorry, I had a client tell me hers was like a little bit better than mine because she kept saying, I just feel like I don't have anything left. And she was like, or what is left is like kind of like a gas tank was her example. Like, how at the very bottom is like the dirt, debris, the nastiness, the backwashy kind of stuff. So she was like, that just gave such a visual for her and to know that I can't get this empty because then that's what I'm running on is all that nasty gunk.
that
I was like,
backwash.
"Ooh, I know back pocket that one."
Yeah. And so for all the single not single, but all the non-mothers listening,
Yeah,
I think one of the things my line sister, when she had a baby, when she got married, I like gave her some space. And when we talked, she said, "Don't put boundaries on me that I didn't set for myself." And so
I
for
love that.
I keep that with me because I think for people who don't have kids,
Yeah,
it might be easy to assume because you mentioned like how some mamas they have kids and maybe they don't have a social life anymore. I think even for us with people without kids, it's easy for us to then put that on mothers. Like, okay,
yeah,
now you got a kid. I'm not saying that you should be at home, but I expect that you probably do want to be at home. And
right.
so I'm gonna just share that for the people that don't have kids, don't put boundaries on mamas that didn't ask for them. It's good to have open conversation with folks and see where they are at instead of just
Mhm.
automatically assuming that your friend who's now a mom is going to go inside of her own shell and no longer be present. Still, you still have the opportunity to invite mama's places and see what feels comfortable to them as they are continuing to journey through the process of like who they are now with this additional title of.
I think that's a great call out. My friends had babies before me, and I struggled with that with like the first two friends that had babies. I was the same way. I stepped back. I was like, it's nurturing time. I'm not gonna be blowing you up anymore and begging for you to come outside, as they say. But now, like becoming a mom before the rest of my friends became moms, I realized how important that conversation was that you're mentioning. Just that communication of, hey, what do you need? Right. And it's so easy for us to say, oh, nothing, I'm good. The baby's good. Everything's fine. But like really taking the opportunity to check in. Because now my friends and I, we get together at least once a quarter, but we're consistently checking in with each other or we FaceTime or whatever else because we realize that we may not need to really see each other physically all the time, but we definitely need a safe space to vent and be ourselves without judgment. And so I think you hit the nail on the head with like your support system should genuinely be your support system and set that expectation with them, just like you do with your kids and your spouse and your family, to let them know how they can be there for you.
Yeah. So I wanted to know, so you mentioned about the pouring from an empty cup and like what getting the backwash. And I think that is a great thing to think about. Like, honestly, it's going to permeate inside of my head. Like, oh, you're giving backwash right now to other
I
people.
love that.
Yeah. So, but are there any other like mantras or sayings that you think that mamas could say to themselves when like that guilt starts creeping in?
I'm not gonna lie. Usually I base it on whatever their motivation is. Like, why do you need this? Why do you need this time? What have you been noticing from yourself or from your own experiences, right? So I don't just stick with, oh, I've been overstimulated or I've been overwhelmed. No, what exactly is overwhelming? What is overstimulating? How do you react? How do you respond in those moments? What does it do to you, right? Because our kids and our family is important and we already know how it's impacting them. How is it impacting you? Right? Because there are a lot of times we feel those negative emotions and feelings and we either avoid them or we sink a little too deep into them. When we really should take them in, analyze them, and let them be motivation for that change. So usually I base the mantra off what they have going on. So for me, myself, I was the overstimulated mommy. So the hearing the mommy 30 times a day, plus the sink was dripping randomly, it was driving me crazy. And so I would take a deep breath. And even now my kids say, take a deep breath, think, what does mommy need? And like that was it. And like I had to force myself, this was definitely not an overnight deal, but I had to force myself to really not move. I would completely stop and go, what do I need? And sometimes it was that I need to step out of the room. Other times I realized I hadn't eaten all day. You could really check in on yourself to ensure that you're not draining even throughout the day. But I think the mantra is so unique to whatever you're experiencing.
Yeah, no, I love that. I think, you said stop, and take a breath. What do you need? That's one of the things that I tell my clients, regardless, like whatever, when things are coming up for you, being able to just take a moment and consider what is this communicating to me?
Right.
And so, even for mamas who are struggling with guilt, to consider what is the guilt communicating to me?
That's
What do
right.
I need to know about this? Right. Another thing that I saw on like social media, and it was in regard to racism and someone having the
Mhm.
audacity to continue to ask why on some of the hateful messages that they've been taught. But it kind of visualized the process that I think is important for a lot of people, especially when we've been given some rigid rules on how we should live our lives, to question why. So as a therapist, Jessica, you know that we were taught in school that we don't ask the direct question, why? Sometimes I break that now, but we were taught that, right? Like not to ask why, because if they knew why, they wouldn't be here. But really what I've learned with my process of being a therapist over these years is allowing people to just get curious. You don't have to have the answer. I want you to be a scientist and really just consider, if you could come up with a theory, what would it say, right? And so going back to the thing that I saw on social media, was asking why for every single like hateful thing that they thought about this group of people. And also Marie Kondo, if you ever read the book
Oh,
Spark
yeah.
Joy or The Art of Tidying Up, she talks about asking yourself why 3 times, right? And so like when you come up with something, why? So if you say to yourself, I cannot go out with my friends this week, why? Or why? Because I'm a mother. Why? And try to see what your mind comes up with. And again, It doesn't have to be right. Just consider these things as theories. Get curious with it. What could it be telling you? And allow that to kind of give you some information to decide what you want to do. And sometimes you decide to do nothing, and that's okay. But again, you've allowed yourself to sit a little bit longer than just the answer is no, period.
Exactly. And I agree with you, Denisha. I know we were told not to ask it, but I usually tell my clients, my patients, I'm like, here we go, 5 whys. And
Yes.
none of the answers can be the same. So, especially with moms, because usually it gets stagnant at the, well, because I'm a mom. And so, why? What does that mean? So, sometimes we're shifting the why a little bit. We're really getting down to the root of what value is in place or what deeply rooted thought is in place that's making this an uncomfortable point. Because most often it's not that we need to change the action, right? I still probably need to go out with my friends or take a moment to finish my book, but at least I know why I'm uncomfortable so that I can maybe form my unique mantra to attack. You see what I mean? To attack that guilty thought. But yeah, we're going against the grain, asking the why question.
Yes, yes. I think it's so important.
Yeah.
So if you are listening, you might not hear your therapist ask you why, but you can ask yourself why 5 times, 3 to 5 times. But I definitely
Mhm.
think the more you ask why, the deeper you can go. So I love the fact that you do 5.
Yeah, and I think most therapists ask why just in different ways, right?
Mhm.
Because we're all like
Mhm.
creative problem solvers. So
Yes.
usually to steal your words, we're like, where's that guilt coming from? Right?
Mhm. What do you
Where are
think
you feeling
comes
it in your
where do you think
body?
that comes from?
What
Yes.
what experience does this remind you of? Those are all different like ways of asking why.
Exactly.
Yeah.
These are just the rules,
Yeah,
quote unquote. But a good thing is a lot of us are rule breakers.
that's right. That's right.
All for the sake of helping our clients. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about enforcing boundaries because I know for some people who may have gone from soft boundaries to now I need to set boundaries, they move to the rigid side of things. Like sometimes it could be very easy for us to go from 0 to 100. So I had no boundaries and now I'm very rigid. And
Yes.
because I'm rigid, the way that I communicate these boundaries might be I have a boundary, so you better not do X, Y, and Z, right? And
Mhm.
that there's a big difference of like enforcing your boundaries and demanding that other people enforce your boundaries for you. So can you talk a little bit about like the behavioral difference of I have a boundary, I am going to set it and enforce it for myself versus expecting other people to enforce your boundaries for you?
For sure. So usually I root boundaries in the things that we value or prioritize because then from there you can make a multitude of boundaries, flexible, strict, whatever the case may be. But at least you've established your why, you've attached it to your value of family, your value of money, whatever it is, right? And so I know this is pretty cliche, but I usually tell people to start small. Start with a small change that you can literally make overnight because we need a quick win, right? To start that momentum going. And usually I stick with all the C's. So communicate, right? After you're curious, that's where you kind of figure out where your values are and things of that sort. Communicate what it is. I'm just going to use one of mine. I don't accept calls after 7 p.m., right? So now I have to be consistent to your point. So I will consistently not respond to calls after 7 p.m. unless they're emergencies, right? So it is a little bit of a flexible boundary, but most folks know, I think most of my people now associate 7 p.m. with like bedtime for me. So, but you have to be consistent in that. And so what I did when I first started setting those boundaries and what I usually recommend is that people have a saying that they can fall back on that is assertive yet respectful if someone crosses the boundary. Because here's the thing, to your point, this is where people get rigid and they're just like, I have to cut this person off, and they block them for maybe a week and then they unblock them because they're like, I missed their voice or something, right? So there's this whole inconsistent cycle that starts instead of just communicating. Yet again, go back to step 2. Hey, Denisha, this doesn't sound like an emergency, and I'm spending time with my family right now, so I'm going to call you back in the morning. After 7, I usually don't answer the phone, right? I'm reminding you, I'm attaching it to my priority, really more so for myself than for you. You don't care about my family, right? You had something to talk about. But I'm reminding myself of what the value was. And that way I'm consistently teaching my brain even what the value is or what the priority is in this moment. So it's kind of like a twofer there. Now, if Denisha keeps calling me after 7 o'clock, Now we have to confront the issue. And, Denisha, for us, we used to the word confront and we don't take it any kind of ways, but I know a lot of people have like a negative connotation associated with it. And it's not the case. It's really having a firmer communication with the person. Hey, I've noticed this. It makes me feel like this. I feel like this when this happens, right? Very ABC communication, one-on-one kind of skills, but just to approach that issue with the person, because it's quite often that people are just like, oh my gosh, yes, completely forgot. After 7, that's just not your jam anymore. I was just used to calling you. Because it's more than likely that this person has gotten used to one of two things. Number one, you not having boundaries at all. Or number two, you having this cycle of boundary, no boundary, boundary, no boundary, boundary, no boundary, right? And so you're telling them and you're confronting the issue by saying, no, this cycle has ended or that has ended. This is something I'm working towards. And then I tell people, how can you enforce that boundary, right? And it's not necessarily always cutting people off. I know that's the first thing that most people go to because you see it as easy, but it's really not. And you've learned nothing from it. If anything, you've
Mm-hmm.
associated setting boundaries with a lack of relationships, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
instead, I'm like, what can you just do consistently? So if I can answer for Denisha one day out the week when she calls after 7, just to remind her, hey, no calls after 7, cool. That's my way of reinforcing it. However, if I say, Denisha, you've done this for like a week or two straight now, it's really inappropriate. I've said that I don't accept calls after 7. Is this an emergency? Right? That's the way I'm reinforcing it. And I get off the phone. I usually tell people the way you reinforce a boundary it should be a behavior you could do anywhere. If I'm at the doctor's office, if I'm sitting right next to my mom, if I'm with my kids, I should be able to say this same statement over and over and over again, or do the same action over and over and over again, no matter who's around, right? Now, most people, contrary to popular belief, they will eventually follow the boundary, they will respect it. But again, you're teaching them how to treat you. For those who continuously disrespect it and you have a communication about it and they're like, yeah, I understood it, I'm just choosing not to do that, like, I'm available after 7, so be available. No, unfortunately, I will not be answering your calls after 7. And at that point, it's up to you to choose, is this something to end the relationship about, or will we both just know you're going to call me after 7, but I'm not going to answer? So that's that piece where like the boundaries are so flexible, but if you stick with that curious communication, consistency, like those C's will drive you straight way through setting realistic expectations so that you can reinforce your boundaries.
I love that because number one, you give space for the flexibility that you mentioned in the first
Mm-hmm.
statement that you said. Do not call me after 7 unless it's an emergency. So for me, I'm like, well, I don't accept calls after 7. Do not disturb. But does that give you room to know if there is emergency? I guess if they call you twice, it'll ring through. But still, you still give the ability to kind of communicate and see the other person as, okay, maybe you need something. Okay, you don't need anything. Let's go. We're going to get
Mm-hmm.
off the phone now. So I like how you really, showed that to us through the 3 C's. And at the end of the day, again, saying if this person is not going to respect the boundary, I also will not pick up the phone because now I've communicated, I've confronted it as well. You bring up a good point that I also want to make sure for the folks that are listening, they understand the
Yeah.
difference between boundary crossing and boundary violations. Because in this scenario, you mentioned the crossing and the violation. So, is there
Yeah.
anything that you want to say to the differences that can show up for boundary crossing versus a boundary violation?
Okay, so if you guys haven't learned by now, I'm all about imagery and visuals. I feel like when people hear me and then they could paint this picture in their brain, it just sticks. So with boundary crossing, literally think about a road or a street, right? You have the pedestrian crossing, you have the oh gosh, forgive me, but the person that holds the sign, I forget that title. So sorry, you're important, I promise. But you have that person holding the sign that's like, hey, pedestrians can cross now, or no, they cannot. Because I want you to think about when the pedestrian is like, or that person says, hey, no pedestrians could go right now. Everyone is driving and they're going, and you have that random kid that runs out in the road. Everybody stops their brakes. The cross guard, I think that's their title.
Yes, the crossing guard. Yep.
It's like, oh my goodness. And they, probably grab the child up or whatever to ensure that they're safe and put them back where they belong. That is the image I want in your mind when you think about a boundary crossing. This is someone that just got a little off track, wasn't paying attention, just forgot. It's just used to walking, right? As they're going across, but you need to pull them back to realign them with your new expectations. Okay. Now, boundary violation is at that point, you probably hit that fourth C of like, I confront it, right? The issue, this continuously happens. So you have the kid that's running across the street every day, doesn't care that the cross guard is telling them to stop. That's a violation. I know it's wrong. I understand there are expectations in play, and I am choosing to still do whatever I want to do, despite or regardless of how everyone feels about it. That's a very clear difference between crossings and boundary violations. Okay. Most often, boundary violations do end in like that relationship looking very different, right? So imagine that kid coming up, or the cross guard at this point probably knows it's almost 7. Little Timmy is about to come and go run across that street. She's probably standing in a different place now. She's probably already giving him that eye of don't do it. You know what's going to happen, right? And so this is where we're coming into that consequence. What's going to happen to little Timmy? Are we calling mom? Are we making it to where he can't ride the school bus anymore, or he has to ride the school bus instead of walk? Like that imagery, it will help you paint a picture on whether or not it's a crossing, violation, and how I need to respond to it.
I love that. I love that. So, and the differences that I hear, one with the boundary crossing, unintentional, whoops, I made a mistake, or whoops, I forgot, it's a misunderstanding. But with the violation, you've been told,
Mm-hmm.
and you continue to do it. So at this point,
Yes.
it seems to be intentional, and it seems to be dismissive of what's been stated as a boundary. And I think it's important for us to have talked about that, because people are human and they
Yeah.
err, right? And just because you set a boundary does not mean that someone intentionally decided to violate it, but they crossed it because maybe they forgot, and will need a couple of reminders to remember something that you just set for yourself, and it's a change.
Right.
And so, yeah, just remembering those things for the listeners, especially when you've gone for a while not having a boundary up, that the people in your life are going to need some time to adjust and transition to your new boundaries.
Yeah, you've been thinking about it this whole time on what you needed or what you wanted, and now you finally verbalized it, but this is everybody else's first time hearing it, first time knowing about it. And so giving a little grace there. But to your point, when it's a crossing, it doesn't feel as harmful because usually you come back to the person and they're remorseful about it. But then once a violation, usually there's very little remorse, or it's a hey, I should be that one outlier to that boundary. It's like no, because it's all about how I'm treating me.
Yes, yes. All right, Jessica. Well, we have come to the point of the show where we're going to do roulette. So
Okay.
we have three different options, and depending on the number that you get, you're going to answer the question based on that. So the first option is that's between me and my therapist. This is where I might ask you a question that you're still working on as it pertains to boundary setting. The next one is hard to swallow. This is where I'm going to ask you to confront a truth that we know that we need to accept, but we really don't
Mhm.
want to. And permission slip is about giving ourselves permission to do, feel, embrace something without guilt. I'm going to roll the roulette wheel. Are you ready?
Okay, yes.
All right. And we have number two. So you have hard to swallow. Jess, what truth do we need to accept, but we really don't want to?
This one, okay, it still relates to boundaries, but it's a little twist with the finances. I need to swallow and or accept that I'm going to be like a part of that first generation in my family that actually has their finances in order. You know, and I mean it on a very basic scale, like actually has a have a savings, very little debt. We're not counting student loans. That's with the Lord. But
Take it up to the Lord. It ain't,
yes,
you can't
yes.
take it with you.
Yeah, I'm letting them talk that out. But yeah, like really being able to accept that. I find myself getting frustrated sometimes if I learn that certain family members don't have a savings or haven't done the right things financially to be able to have stability in their lives. And while I know I'm frustrated because I hate they're in this situation, I can't get them out of it. I can't save them, right? The other piece of it is understanding that we're not in the same space, and so I really need to meet them where they are with that. I'm no better, but I'm still trying to do better in that area.
Yes, yes. You break in generational patterns.
Yeah.
Generational patterns, we all know, we understand. You're doing things differently, and it's a lot of education that you likely had to give yourself, but then also you're in the position to give that education back. Doesn't mean
Yeah.
it's without its frustrations, though. Yes. Well, Jess, I thank you so much for coming on the Whole Black Woman podcast. And I didn't say it when we first got here, but thank you for being our first guest as we shift gears. As the listeners know, it's just been me recording with affirmations. Thank you for being the first person to come here and teach us how to set some boundaries. And now, for those who are listening, they want to stay connected with you. Tell them how to find you.
Yes. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having me, especially as the first. That's pretty monumental.
Yay!
But I will say, if this conversation resonated with you guys in any way, you could connect with me on Instagram at therapistjess_. And I'm actually launching a podcast really soon called the Balanced Woman Podcast, where we discuss all of this in more detail. So, but follow me on either platform where I share lots of strategies about juggling work, business, and family, putting a structure in place so you don't drop the ball, right? And making sure you have a routine and some boundaries in place so you can be productive without burning out.
All right. And with that, it is a wrap. Thank you so much. And we'll catch you all on the next show.